you can build your Docker image on an EC2 instance and push it to Amazon ECR. The same process you use to build your Docker image on your computer is the same process you will use to build your Docker image on an EC2 instance. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. Just as you can build your Docker image on your computer, you can also build your Docker image on an EC2 instance. So today I'll show you how to build your Docker image on an EC2 instance if you have to do that. All right, so I prepared this note on the steps we have to take to build our Docker image on an EC2 instance. So let's talk about the prerequisite. Before you build your Docker image on an EC2 instance, you have to understand pretty much how to launch an EC2 instance and how to SSH into your EC2 instance. We are going to use a default VPC in this demo, but you can also use the same process when you have a custom VPC. So the first thing we have to do is create a personal access token in our GitHub account, because we will be storing our Docker file in our GitHub account. Then once we create the personal access token, we are going to create a repository where we will add the Docker file. Then we will create an IAM role. We will add the IAM role to the EC2 instance, which will allow the EC2 instance to be able to push our image to ECR. Once we build the image, the IAM role will allow us to push the image to Amazon ECR. Then we will SSH into the EC2 instance. We will install Docker on it, then clone the repository we created that we have added our Docker file to. That is step 7. Then once we've done that, we can build our image. So this build command is the same command we are using for the project you guys are working on now. But if you are working on any Docker project and you need to build your Docker image, you guys know that the command to build a Docker image is docker build. Then you specify the tag and the name of the image you want to give it. But since we are using build argument in our project, and in this example, I will be using the Docker file from the project. That is why I have build arguments in here. Once we have built our Docker image, we will create an ECR repository. In this demo, I'll show you how to create an ECR repository from the EC2 instance. You can do that as well. Once we have done that, we will push our image to the ECR repository we created. These are the high-level steps, and I will include these notes in the Slack channel so you guys can have it. So we said the first thing we have to do is create a personal access token. To create a personal access token, you go into your GitHub account. In your GitHub account, select this icon up here and select settings. Then on this page, scroll down, select developer settings, and here select personal access tokens. And once you select the personal access token here, you'll see define green tokens or tokens classic. We will use the classic one, so select it. And you can see I already have a personal access token. I'll delete it and I'll just create another one. So to create a personal access token, click this drop down under generate new token and select the generate new token classic again. On that note, this is where you will give your personal access token a name. So I'm just going to enter mine. Once you've given your personal access token a name, under expiration, this is where you specify how long you want to use the token before it expires. So I will select 90 days for this token. And under scope, this is where you select the permission you want to give to the token. To be able to clone your repository using personal access token, you can select the repo scope, and that will allow you to clone your repository. Once you select repo scope, scroll down and click generate token. One thing I want to note is that when you create a personal access token, you will only be able to see that token on this page the first time you create it. If you click out of this page, you will not be able to see this token anymore. So once you have created your personal access token, the first thing I want you to do is click this box to copy it. Once you copy it, open your notes and just paste it somewhere in there. So since I just created my token, I'm going to paste it here. Then that's the first step. The next thing we are going to do is create a repository in our GitHub account and add our Docker file to it. So to create a repository, select this icon here and select new, give the repository a name. Once you've given your repository a name, you can add a description if you want. And under the description, we are going to select private. Anytime you are creating a repository, it is always best practice to use private repository and use the personal access token to clone the repository wherever you want to clone it to. So you can either use the personal access token or you can use the SSH keys. Then once you have select private, we are going to add a README file into this repository, then scroll down and click Create Repository. So we have created our repository. The next thing we will do is add our Docker file in it. So once you have created the Docker file that you want to build, you will add that Docker file into the repository. In this demo, I am using the Docker file we created for our project. So that is the Docker file I'm going to add into my repository. To build the Docker file that I'm using in this demo, I'm going to need my app service provider.php file, and I'm also going to need the Docker file. Those are the two things I need. So to add these files into my GitHub repository, I'm going to select Add File here and select Upload Files. Then I'm going to drag my Docker file into that repository, and I'm also going to drag my app service provider.php file into that repository. Once I have added the files in the repository, you'll see the files here, then click Commit Changes. And that is step 2 in Slack. The next thing we have to do once we add our file into the repository is we will create an IAM role. This role is the role we will attach to the EC2 instance to allow us to push our image to Amazon ECR once we build it. So in the management console, type IAM in the search box and select IAM under services. On the IAM dashboard, click roles and click create role. Under trusted entity type, we will select AWS service, and under use case, type EC2 in here. Once you select the dropdown, you'll see EC2 here selected. Then scroll down and click next. On this page, we are going to use an administrator access for this demo. This just allows us to have the access we need to be able to push our Docker image into Amazon ECR and also to build our Docker image. But when you are working in a production environment, don't use administrator access. So you need to narrow it down to whatever your EC2 instance needs to build the image and create the repository and push the image to Amazon ECR. Once you have selected your policy, scroll down and click next. Then on this page, give your role a name. Once you've given your role a name, scroll down and click create role. We have created the role. If I click view role, the role is here. The next thing we are going to do according to our note is we will launch our EC2 instance. And for this demo, I am using the default VPC. So I'm going to type VPC in the search box and select VPC under services. Yes. So Ahmed asks, can we use our own personal managed policies to, in this scenario where we are building our Docker image on an EC2 instance and pushing it to ECR? Yes, you can create your own custom policy that specifically limited to what you want the EC2 instance to do. So yes, you can create your own custom policy. On this VPC page, I have a default VPC. So if I select this dropdown, you can see my VPC here. And if I select your VPCs, this is the default VPC. This is the VPC that comes with your AWS account. Like I said, if you are working in a production environment, if you have to do this at work, make sure you build your Docker image in a custom VPC. The same process you use to build your Docker image in a custom VPC is the same process you will use in this default VPC. So the process is not different, but just keep in mind that it is always best practice to use custom VPC when you are working in a production environment. So the next thing we are going to do is launch an EC2 instance. So in the search box, I'm going to type EC2 and select EC2 under services. On the EC2 page, I'm going to click launch instance and I'm going to give the instance a name. Once you give the EC2 instance a name, scroll down. Under AMI, we are going to use Amazon Linux, and the AMI is going to be Amazon Linux 2023. Then scroll down. Under instance type, use T2 micro and scroll down. Under key pair, since I don't have the EC2 instance connect endpoint installed now, I'm just going to use an SSH key to SSH into my EC2 instance. So I'm going to click create new key pair. Then here, give your key pair a name. I'm going to call it Docker demo. Once you've given your key pair a name, the key pair type is going to be RSA. Under the private key file format, you are going to select PEM file if you are using a Mac computer, or if you are going to use PowerShell on a Windows computer to SSH into your EC2 instance, then you select the PEM format. And if you want to use PuTTY on a Windows computer, this PPK format is only applicable to if you are using PuTTY on a Windows computer to SSH into your EC2 instance. So since I am using PowerShell to SSH into my EC2 instance, I'm going to select .pem, then click Create Key Pair. When you create the key pair, remember that anytime you create a key pair, two keys are always generated for you, the public key and the private key. The key that you see that just got downloaded on my computer, if I go to this folder, in my downloads directory, a key was downloaded. When you create your key pair, the same thing will happen. The key you see in here, this is your private key. The key that you see in the management console here that we add to the EC2 instance, that is the public key. So the public key stays in AWS, and that is the key you can add to any EC2 instance. The private key is the key that will be downloaded on your computer, and that key is what you will use to SSH into your EC2 instance. So once we have created the key, scroll down here. Under network settings, we will just launch it in our default VPC. And even if you click edit here, it will show you the same. Here, I only have the default VPC. I'll select it. Under subnet, you can select this drop down and pick any subnet. In your default VPC, all the subnets are the same, and they are all public subnets. Under auto assign public IP, we will enable it. And under firewall security group, here we will create a new security group. Let's call the security group Docker SSH. So once you've given the security group a name, you can leave the description as default. Under inbound security group rules, the type is going to be SSH because we want to SSH into our EC2 instance. SSH is on port 22, and the source is going to be from our IP address. So make sure you don't set your SSH to anywhere. Always limit it to your IP address. Here, I'll select my IP. Once I select my IP, it is going to limit it to my IP address here. Then let's scroll down. Under configure storage, because we are using this EC2 instance to build a Docker image, we can give it more memory because it will need that to build the Docker image. So here, type 20. You can use 20. I'm just going to type 20 in there. And once you increase the size to 20, scroll down. Under advanced details, select this drop down. And under instance profile, select this drop down and select the ECR role we created. Once you select that role, scroll down, and that's all we really need here. So scroll down here and click launch instance. So I've launched the EC2 instance, and I'm just going to wait for the EC2 instance to be running. Then I will SSH into it. So I'm going to click refresh, and my EC2 instance is running. The next thing I'm going to do is SSH into my EC2 instance. You guys remember when I SSH into my EC2 instance, whether you are working on a Windows computer or a Mac computer, this is what I recommend doing. Anytime you create your key pair and the private key is downloaded on your computer, that key is going to be downloaded to your downloads directory. So as you guys know, anytime you SSH into your EC2 instance using either PowerShell or the Mac computer, you have to specify the path to your private key. So what I mean is that if you open PowerShell on your Windows computer or you open your terminal on a Mac computer, to SSH into your EC2 instance, you are going to type SSH space -I, then you specify the path to your private key. Since your private key is in the downloads directory, you have to specify the full path to your private key. But on a Windows computer, when you use PowerShell, and on a Mac computer, your terminal always opens to your home directory. If you look here, whatever address you see, whether you are working on a Windows computer or a Mac computer, that is the home directory on your computer. So what I recommend you do is move your private key into that directory. So when you look here, you see that my home directory is C users admin. So here, I'm going to open a folder on my computer. Once you open the File Explorer, select C, and the next directory is users, select users, and the next directory is admin. On your computer, it might be your name. Select it, and this is the home directory on my computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my private key from this directory. Once I cut it from that directory, I'm going to paste it in this home directory. So you can see my private key in that directory. The reason why I did that is now to SSH into my EC2 instance, I'm just going to type SSH-I, then I'm going to type the name of the key without having to specify the full path to my downloads directory. So since my key is already in my home directory, and the name of the key is Docker demo. Here, I'm just going to type Docker-demo. Once you type the name of any file or directory in the same directory you are currently in, if you press the tab key, it will auto-complete it for you. Then, once we add the name of our private key, add another space, and we are going to type the username of our EC2 instance, which is EC2-user at the public IPv4 address of our EC2 instance. So here, select your EC2 instance in the console and copy the public IPv4 address. Here, I'm going to paste it here and press enter. So before I press enter, whether you are working on a Windows computer or a Mac computer, the process is the same. The command you will run is ssh-i, the path to your private key, and the username of your EC2 instance at the public IPv4 address. Then press enter. The first time you try to SSH into your EC2 instance, it will ask you this question, type yes, and we have SSH into the EC2 instance. The next thing we will do once we SSH into the EC2 instance is we are going to install Docker. So since I am working on an Amazon Linux 2023 EC2 instance, here I'm just going to type in Google. In my Google search, I'm going to type install on Amazon Linux 2023, since that's what I'm using. And when you get the search result, look for the AWS documentation. I see this documentation from AWS here. I'm going to select it. So here, to install our Docker image, if you scroll down here, they are telling you to install Docker on Linux. Since our EC2 instance is Linux, we are going to select this drop down and scroll down. It is telling us this is the command we have to run to install Docker on either Amazon Linux 2 or Amazon Linux 2023. First, we have to run sudo yum update. So I'm going to copy this command, and on my EC2 instance, I'll paste it there, press enter. So there is nothing to update on our EC2 instance. I'm going to dock this. So once we update our EC2 instance, the next thing we are going to do is we are going to install the latest Docker package, right? So it is telling you here, if you are using an Amazon Linux 2 instance, you run this command. And if you are using Amazon Linux 2023, you run this command. Since my EC2 instance is Amazon Linux 2023, I'm going to run this command. So I'll copy it from here and paste it here and press enter. It is now installing Docker, and I'll wait for it to finish installing it. Okay, so once we have installed Docker on the EC2 instance, the next thing we are going to do is start the Docker service. So here, we'll copy this command, paste it here, press enter. Then once you have run that command, the next thing we will do is add our EC2 user to the Docker group. This allows your EC2 user to be able to build your Docker image without having to specify sudo every time you build any image or you run Docker commands. So we are going to copy this and paste it here, press enter. And this is also telling you that once you have run this command, you need to restart your terminal. So I'm just going to close my terminal and open PowerShell again. Then I'm going to SSH back into my EC2 instance. Once we have SSH back into our EC2 instance, it is asking us to verify that we can run Docker commands. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here, press enter. So when you get this output, it means that you have done everything correctly and you can now run Docker commands on this EC2 instance. So that is this step here. So the next thing we are going to do is clone our Git repository on this EC2 instance. Before we clone our GitHub repository on this EC2 instance, we have to make sure that Git is installed. So that is actually one step that I'm missing here. So before you clone it, install Git. So we have to install Git. To install Git, I believe the command is sudo git install. Let's try that. Well, I don't remember the command, so I'm just going to Google it. Let me see. Linux command to install Git. Oh, okay. So a sudo yum, that's what I'm missing. Sudo yum install Git. So this is the command here. I'm going to copy it and paste it here. Okay, it is asking me. I'm going to type yes and press enter. Okay, I've installed Git. Once you have installed Git, the next thing we are going to do is clone our repository. Remember, our repository is a private repository. To clone a private repository, we have to add our personal access token into the URL we will use to clone our repository. So the command is git clone, and we will add our personal access token here. So the personal access token I created earlier, which is this one, I'm going to copy it and add it here, Then once you add your personal access token, here we are going to add our GitHub username. Your GitHub username is the name you see here. I'm going to enter that here. And here we are going to add our repository name. And the repository name is the repository we have created where we add our Docker file to. I called it Docker demo. So you can either copy it here or you can just type it here. So I called it Docker demo. This is the full command we will use to clone our private repository on the EC2 instance. So once you have created your command, select it and copy it. Then in my terminal, I'm going to clear the screen first, then paste that command there and press enter. And we have successfully cloned our private repository on the EC2 instance. If you type ls, you can see the repository here. Then we are just going to change our directory into that repository. So type cd and the name of the repository and press enter. So I've changed my directory into the repository, which is here. And now if I type ls, you can see that in this repository, I have my Docker file and the app service provider.php file. So once you have changed your directory into the repository you cloned on the EC2 instance. And as you guys can see, when it comes to learning, what I want you guys to focus on is always the high level concept of what you are trying to do. Like the same way I've created a note here where I am thinking about the process I will use to build a Docker image on an EC2 instance. I don't necessarily know, just like as you guys saw with install git, that I don't remember the command because I really don't focus on memorizing commands. I just focus on the high level knowledge of what do I need to do. If I need to install something or if I need to build my Docker image on an EC2 instance, what do I need to allow me to do that? And once I have the high level notes of what I need to do, then I can focus on the details of what the commands will be. So that is the method I use, and I will recommend that you guys try it out. Don't always focus on memorizing the commands. Certainly if you know a command, that's fine, but always focus on the high level knowledge. So once I've cloned my repository on the EC2 instance, the next thing I'm going to do is run my Docker command to build my Docker image. Remember I said the Docker file that I'm using for this demo, I have some build arguments in it. That is why I am using this command. But if you are trying to build another Docker image, all you have to type is Docker build space, then you specify your tag, which is -t, then the name you want to call it, then you specify a period. So this period just means that the Docker file you are trying to build is in the same directory you are currently in. So because I have build arguments in my Docker file, that is why I am using these scripts that I've prepared. So I'm going to copy this command and paste it here. And you can see it is now building my Docker image. I'll give it some time to build it. Then once it is done building the image, I'm going to create my ECR repository from the same EC2 instance and push the image to the Amazon ECR repository. So while it is building the Docker image, does anyone have any question?
Yes, Aziz, I have a question.
Yes.
So in what situation can we build an image on EC2 and on Docker itself and push it to a Docker hub, for instance, like we did in the last project? So I'm just wondering, like, when do we need to use EC2 and when do we need to use Docker to build our image? Thank you.
It's just your preference. When you are working at work, most engineers use their computer to build their Docker image. But as Tessie was working on his project, he's having issues. It was taking too long to build his Docker image on his computer. So that was when I suggest using the EC2 instance to build it. So it just depends on what your preference is. And one of the ways I can see you using an EC2 instance is when you are working on CI/CD, where you want the entire process to be automated, where you don't have to be there to build the image. You want to set everything up. Pretty much in your CI/CD, you will set up all the process we have covered here. And when you build the image, it is going to build the image for you. Once you build your Docker image on the EC2 instance, then the next step is pushing it to the ECR repository. So I'll just wait for it to finish building the Docker image and we will push it to the ECR repository. Okay. It has finished building my Docker image. Then the next thing I'm going to do is create the repository in ECR that I want to push the image to. So if you guys want to create a repository from your EC2 instance, you can do that with this CLI command. or you can create the repository in the management console yourself. So here, I'm going to try running this command and see if I can create the repository from my EC2 instance. So I'm just going to call the repository this name. This is the AWS CLI command to create a repository in your AWS account. So I'm going to copy this command and I'll paste it here, press enter. And when you get this output, it has successfully created the repository. You will see the repository information here. The main thing you want is the repository URI. And also if you go in your management console, you will also see the repository there. If I go in the management console and I type ECR and select Elastic Container Registry, this is the repository, and you also see the URI of the repository here. So once you have created the repository, the next thing we are going to do is push our Docker image to it. Before you push your Docker image, the first thing you have to do is retag your Docker image. So here on our EC2, if we type Docker, I believe the command is Docker image ls, you are going to see the Docker image we just built here. Before you can push this image into your ECR repository, you have to retag it. So that is why we have this command here, Docker tag, and you are going to tag the name of the Docker image, right? I call it next. You are going to tag it to the URI of your repository. So here, the repository I created is called next2. Usually this number is always the same. So if I go into here and copy the URI, or you can also copy it from the management console here, right? And you come to your command, you see that it is the same. Then once you have that command, copy and in PowerShell, paste it here, press enter. We have retagged that Docker image. So if we type Docker image ls again, you can see it here. Then once you retag it, the next thing we have to do is log into ECR. To log into Amazon ECR, this is the command you use. It is an AWS CLI command, and it is Docker login. You specify your username, and this is just the same account ID as what you are seeing here. And also, I believe if you go into your console, it is the same number you see here. So it's just your account ID. So once you use this command, let me show you the full command. This is the full command. Another thing is you also have to keep in mind what region the ECR repository you created is located in. I'm using US East 1. So whatever region you are using, make sure you specify it here. Then I'm going to copy this and paste it here. Press enter. You can see I've successfully logged in here. Then once you log in, the next thing you'll do is push your image. So I'm going to come to my notes. This is the command to push your image. So keep in mind, the image you want to push is the one you retagged. So if I type Docker image ls, the image I want to push is the one I retagged, not this one. So I have to just update my notes here and make sure this is 2. So that would be that image. The command is Docker push and the URI of that image, or here it is called the repository. So once you create your command, paste it here. So the command is Docker push and the repository name you see here. Then press enter, and it is now pushing the image to the ECR repository. So this is what I want to demo, how you can build your Docker image on an EC2 instance and push the image to Amazon ECR. As Ahmed asked the question, why would you build your Docker image on an EC2 instance as opposed to building it on your computer? It is your preference. But when you are creating a CI/CD pipeline where you want to automate everything, that is one of the scenarios where I can see you using an EC2 instance.